My name's Glenn Harrison. Great pleasure to be speaking to you. I'm really enjoying this. And the last session for me was actually quite affecting as a researcher to see those sorts of statements. My co-authors on this work, Morten Lau, he's in the other session, and he's presenting straight after me on almost a sequel to this exercise. Don Ross is here. Don is currently the Dean at the Waikato Management School, also associated with University of Cape Town and SEER, my centre. And this is a part of a larger project we're looking at. I'm going to be talking about the psychiatric measures of gambling in the general population, general prevalence questions. So the idea, of course, is not so much to detect people who are in a casino, but to detect what is the at-risk population in the broader population. And what we're going to do is to reconsider some of the approaches that have been adopted here. The motivating questions for us really are, what do we mean by problem gambling? And I'm going to put that in quotation marks because it could be pathological gambling, it could be disordered gambling. I don't want to worry about those semantics right now. That's not important to me. But there are really three sorts of concerns. All three of them are legitimate. They're different angles on what we mean by problem gambling. The first is people that are bad for business. People that disrupt the business. That's a perfectly reasonable concern. People who are creating a bad gaming environment, and that's a perfectly legitimate concern about problem gamblers. The second is people that clinically present for treatment or should clinically present for treatment. And that's the one that has been by far the most commonly adopted measure of problem gambling. Our broad research project as economists is taking a broader view. We're actually interested in the people that suffer a welfare loss from gambling choice. And welfare loss is not the same thing as clinically presenting for treatment. It's a part of it. Clinically presenting for treatment is an important component. But we're going to step back as part of our whole project and ask a broader question. So I'm not going to answer that today. That's part of the broader project. So the question is, what's the prevalence in the population? And can surveys, the traditional surveys, be used to assess prevalence? That's the specific question I'm asking here. Because our overall design is going to be looking at surveys, and I'll be talking about some of them here, and Don and Morten will be talking about the surveys we did in Denmark, looking at PGSI, DSM, flags, GUCS, gas, a few other things as well. So we'll be talking about that for the general population in Denmark. But one of the key feature of our work is that we're going to be taking people who look to be at risk according to one or other of these surveys. We bring them into the lab, or we bring them out, we go to them in the field in Denmark. So these are not students, these are members of the Danish population, but we've selected the people who the surveys say are most at risk, and we bring them into a lab casino, and we study their behavior. So that's the idea. Yes, it's artifactual, yes, it's artificial, but we can control it. We give them a video slot machine, and they've earned some money, and we study their gambling behavior. So the question is, the big question is, to what extent do these surveys correlate with what we actually see when people are playing with real money in a controlled environment, okay? So I'm not going to talk about those issues here today, but therefore we got interested in surveys. So we started looking at the existing surveys because we needed to do that in Denmark, and Morten and Don will be talking about what we actually did in the next session in the other room. And we had some concerns. We have three issues I want to raise with the general way in which surveys have been implemented here. The first issue is that they tend to reflect existing gambling. In a sense, they don't reflect the latent propensity to gamble. Latent just means not directly observed, right? It means you've got a hidden, latent, inner propensity to gamble, and possibly gamble in a risky manner. The existing surveys tend to be focused on, have you had a gambling experience and has it caused certain problems? And I'll talk about that in more detail. So the concern here is if we've got surveys that are designed to reflect existing gambling, they're likely to underestimate the potential gambling problems. Again, we're not saying the traditional surveys are wrong, just that their question is incomplete. For example, what if you're doing a study, and Denmark was a wonderful case like this. They didn't have gambling until a few years ago, legalized gambling. What if you're trying to do a study to figure out how many Danes will be at risk if we legalize gambling? Well, very few of those Danes would have lost 1,000 kroner by definition, because you didn't have gambling. So it's very difficult with those sorts of constructs to get a measure of an at-risk population that hasn't been exposed. The second question, and this sounds technical, but this will be the biggie. This is going to be the take-home message today. Almost all of these surveys, almost all of them, use a trigger question. And basically, the trigger question is something like the following, and I'll give you some examples in a minute, but have you ever lost $100 from gambling? Have you ever lost $200 from gambling? If you answer yes to that, you're actually asked the questions that determine if you're at risk. If you're answering no to that, you should be correctly classified as no detectable risk. They don't ask you the questions. So basically, we ask you a gateway question, a trigger question. If you answer yes to that you've had an experience gambling, you've then asked the later questions. So it could be that you haven't lost $100, but that was just bloody good luck. You might actually be at risk. So that's going to be the concern. To economists, this leads to what's called sample selection bias. In other words, the people that you actually see in the survey are those that have, and the people who present in a sense, are those that have had a problem with gambling. It's not those who might have a problem with gambling. Notice that it's not just semantics. That's a very important distinction. It's the people who, for one reason or another, have fallen in a hole or have had some problem with gambling. You're not even asking the question of those that haven't even lost 100. And I'll explain why we do that. It's not, but that'll be the biggie here. The third point is that very often when we look at comorbidities, that is the relationship between gambling disorders as a psychiatric disorders and other psychiatric disorders, whether substance abuse or anxiety and so forth, we see lots of comorbidities. Gambling's correlated with just about everything. Not quite, but you'll see in a minute when I show you the results. And it could be that that's actually a result of asking a different question. What is asked there is an unconditional question. If you have a mood anxiety, what is the correlation with you also having a gambling disorder? A separate question is, if you have a mood anxiety, you have a substance abuse problem, and you have something else, what's the marginal correlation of you having a gambling disorder? They're different questions. Both of them are legitimate, but the former is what's actually used statistically, and the latter is arguably what we're interested in. I'll explain that as we go along. All right, let's go through each of these quickly then. The surveys are generally reflective, and we're using the word reflective here because in the psychometric literature and the psych literature, there's a distinction between reflective constructs and formative constructs. So reflective constructs intuitively mean they're asking questions that are getting to reflect some attribute of yours. A formative construct is a series of questions that's trying to get at, are you likely to form this belief or form this urge? So they're somewhat different in that sense in terms of their intention. So using the DSM-4 criteria, for example, we tend to ask questions, and I'll get very explicit in a second. Does gambling lead to disruptions in life, like bankruptcy, lying, divorce, or criminal activity, or persistent and recurrent maladaptive gambling behavior? I'll show you the exact questions in a minute, but they all tend to be of that form. Has gambling caused you to be having problems in life, broadly defined? They're not designed to detect latent propensities to gamble, whether or not that leads to problem gambling. So that's the point I was making earlier. If you're interested in the people who are at risk, even if they haven't been at risk, then you have to ask questions that are more formative rather than just reflective. And the idea here is that some surveys have done this. Certainly FLAGS is the one which trumpets itself as worrying about formative constructs as well as reflective constructs. And that's one of the ones we implemented in Denmark. This is very, very widely used by casinos and industries and governments. It's very rarely published. We have some results for Denmark. There's several others, and it can be usefully debated, and I have with my co-authors, whether these actually reflect more formative constructs or reflective constructs, but there's other surveys out there. So I'm not saying that the survey literature has ignored this, but the most popular surveys, the ones that PGSI, DSM-based, so forth, tend to be almost entirely reflective, and I'll show you that in a minute. Let's focus on the second one, the use of the trigger questions. For example, I gave you the sort of question it is, have you ever lost $100 from gambling? And I'll show you in a moment an explicit type of trigger question. They vary. There's usually 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 questions. Only if this is answered yes, do you actually ask the diagnostic questions in DSM or whatever your metric is. So if you say no, you're not asked those questions. Okay? I'll explain in a moment why people do that. It's perfectly obvious why surveyors do that, but we'll talk about it. Many people now classify people who say no to this question as having no detectable risk. In some surveys, they've been classified as not at risk. And that's a semantic point of some distinction. It's not detectable because we haven't asked you the question. That's actually a more accurate classification. Okay? But by definition, they can never show up as problem gamblers because they're never asked the questions that would trigger them being a problem gambler. So to an economist, this is really sample selection bias. Now, just let me say in words what sample selection bias is something that economists are familiar with. Epidemiologists are getting very familiar with it right now. The idea is the following. Is there a process deciding whether you participate in my sample or not? Okay, some statistical process that determines whether you're in my sample or not. If I can model that statistically, I can explain, if there are errors in that term, why you might have a different behavior if you were in the sample. All right? Typically, we just take the sample as it's given to us. Is there a process that contaminates the sample? Think of it that way. And indeed, in some epidemiology literature, that's the way it's referred to. Is the sample contaminated or biased in some way? That's what sample selection corrections are trying to fix. I don't have time here to go into the statistical complexities of it, but the idea is, can you clean the sample? Can you make the sample more representative of the population rather than the people that just showed up? Okay? And I'll give you some intuition in a second why that matters. And as I pointed out, most of the criteria come from DSM, either DSM-4 or 5. There's a hell of a lot of controversy over the evolution from DSM-4 to 5. Have a look at any of Alan Francis's books. I'm not going to waste time, take time on it right now. It wouldn't be a waste of time. But that's a separate issue. It doesn't really affect anything we're doing here. So usually we use the criteria in the DSM. I'm going to put up the ones from DSM-4, which form the basis of the surveys that I'm going to be looking at. So here's the diagnostic criteria for pathological gambling. And you can see here, every question assumes here that someone's done some gambling. It assumes it in 2 ways. First, you're not actually asked the question unless you said you've done some gambling and lost money. But secondly, the language would not be something that you could ask someone who's never done gambling, because it's sort of presuming that you've had a gambling experience. So in that sense, the questions are set up to be reflective. But you've got in DSM-4, 5 or more of these indicate pathological gambling. But my favorite is this one, actually, is my second favorite. Here's one of the criteria. What if you lie to families, therapists, or others, like a surveyor, to conceal the extent of your involvement with gambling? Can anyone see the problem? We're assuming that suddenly you told the truth that you actually have lost $100 from gambling. But then one of the criteria for pathological gambling is, guess what? You lie to people, you hide it. It's like screaming out at you. It's not, and in fact, we'll see, it's been used in all of these massive surveys. I could name many, many more surveys where this is used. I'm going to focus on these big monster ones. Look at the samples. I'm going to look at the US, we're looking at Canada and the UK. I'm going to focus on this classic epidemiological study in the US. All the results are the same for the others, so I'm not going to take your time going through all of them. But this is a massive, massive survey. I should also point out that largely as a result of the low levels of prevalence of pathological or problem gambling, most of the agencies have dropped questions. They're just not asked anymore. The example is the latest NESARC waves in the US, the more recent longitudinal waves, they dropped it because there's such a small percentage. They couldn't justify it. In Canada, the CCHS has a mental health module. It did it in 2002, and indeed it had a modified version of the PGSI that Ferris had a role in. But in 2012, the gambling questions taken out because they got so few gamblers. So we're seeing some serious problems here. Here's the NESARC question. Let me be very explicit. Here's the trigger question. Now I'd like to ask you a few questions about gambling. By gambling, I mean blah, 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 blah. Have you ever gambled at least 5 times in any 1 year of your life? Yes? Then you get asked the questions. No? Skip to section 13. Guess where the gambling questions are? Section 12. So if you say no to that, you're not asked any other questions, right? And indeed, we see a lot of people 74% of the people who are answering no. So here, intuitively, is the nutshell. Is there some part of this 74% who lied? Why might they lie? Because they don't like to talk about their gambling, etc., etc. That's what sample selection correction is all about. And here are some of the specific questions that you can see that they sort of mimic DSM-4. There's actually 15 of them. And indeed, there's the same one here about try to keep your family or friends from knowing how much you gambled. So that's the same loop that I mentioned earlier. And we end up, here are the results from the NESARC. All I'm pointing out is something that's, well, there were only 195 pathological gamblers in this entire survey. There's lots and lots of people filling casinos. You see them, I see them, but only 195 of them happen to meet these criteria. So we get this statistic that the industry loves. Less than 0.5 percentage point of people are the ones you shouldn't let in my casino. Leave the other 99.6% of people alone. And that's the result that we sort of get in a lot of other surveys. Not those exact results, but close to them. So, question. If these trigger questions look really dumb, and hands up anybody that doesn't think they're dumb, why do we ask them? There's a perfectly good reason for asking them in a large survey in particular, and that is, it takes a long time. If you're NESARC and those others, they were asking about lots of psychiatric disorders. They don't have time to ask all of the questions for all of the disorders for all of the people. So that's just a matter of efficiency. But it's not obvious that we run into that problem if we've got some popular instruments that only have a few questions. So what I'm going to say is, we understand that. I've been doing surveys for 30 years. Don's been doing them comparable period of time. We understand that, the time frame issue. I'm going to show you there's a hell of a trade-off from that. We understand it, but there are sometimes you've got to realize you get very different results. The second reason is that most of the follow-on questions sound contrived if someone's never gambled, and that's what I pointed out earlier. They all sort of assume some gambling and ask, has that gambling caused this problem or the other one? But the solution there is just to ask some questions that get at these formative constructs, that don't assume the existence of gambling. The third and fourth reasons, I think, drive a lot of people. First, I think, frankly, it's done because the weight of the backside often exceeds the weight of the intellect when people are designing surveys. I know that because I've done it myself. That's what everybody else has done. So I just follow that. I might modify the trigger question a wee bit, but that's what everyone else has done. So very often, there's no better reason than simply that, and we have to be honest about it. It could also be, and I've run into this, a lot of people said, yeah, I kind of got the inconsistency, Glenn, but it can't be that important. It sounds really minor, right? It is. I'm here to tell you it is. So I'm going to give you that punchline at the very end. The last one is, and we have to be honest about this, some people like generating low estimates of prevalence for industry, and they get funded to do it. So that's a very convenient result for the gambling industry. That might sound cynical unless you know the industry. And I've spent 35 years of my life as testifying expert and publishing academic working against the tobacco industry, so I know what these bastards do, okay? So let's be aware that there are these pressures here. Okay, by the way, it's not just gambling. It's not just we gambling surveyors that have run into this. Here's my favorite from the NESARC, and this is specific social phobias. After the trigger question, they're then asked if they've a strong fear or avoidance of being interviewed. Right? So how do you avoid being interviewed? Oh, that sounds like a trigger question. Let me say no to that. Right? So this is all over the psychiatric disorder surveys. What's the solution? Solution number one is ask them the full set of questions and then ask the threshold questions after the fact. Okay? And we've done that in Denmark, and Morten and Don are going to talk about those results in the next session in the other room. The second solution here, maybe you've run your survey. These are great, beautiful, expensive surveys that I'm talking about, multi-million-dollar surveys. Can you correct for it statistically? The short answer is yes. The longer answer is you've got to make some assumptions. I don't have time here to talk about those, but I'm trying to put my hand up to be honest about that. So you don't get nothing for nothing, right? So you can do some sample selection corrections due to the Nobel laureate Heckman, very standard in economics. I don't have time now to go through even the intuition for that, but so I'm putting that up there that I haven't explained it, how they work, but there are some statistical methods to handle it. As I've said, it's been noticed now in epidemiology in 2011 and 2004 and in psych, so people are aware of these. I've been stunned that epidemiologists don't worry more about this, and I've spent a couple of months carefully reviewing the literature to try to find it. If anyone knows it being done more in psych or in epidemiology with respect to survey questions, I'd love to hear about that, because I don't know. All right, the third point I'll go over quickly. This is the comorbidity point. There's a lot of literature based on NESARC, actually, but essentially saying that pathological gambling is highly comorbid with substance use, mood, anxiety, and personality disorders with implications for treatment and conditions. But the problem is, this is looking at what we call the total effect, or the unconditional comorbidity. It says, if you have this substance abuse problems, what's the correlation with you having a gambling disorder? That's actually a well-posed question, but there's another question you can ask. Given this disorder, and that disorder that you have, what's the correlation then at the margin with you having a psychiatric disorder? Both of those are different questions, and I submit this. I think I'm interested in the second, but they're both valid, okay? So the marginal effect is, think of it, conditional comorbidity or the marginal effect. All right, so the solution here is very simple. You simply estimate it properly. And that's again, straight out of, that's very simple and standard, nothing going on there. You simply add covariates. When I do a regression on whether you've got a psychiatric disorder or not, I include whether you've got this, another disorder, and I look at the marginal effect of gambling. All right, let's get to the specific results. We look at NESARC. There's actually an error in the Petrie et al. They miscalculated the 15. There were 15 questions there, and there were 10 DSMs, and they matched them incorrectly. But it doesn't make a huge difference to their results. And we get so we're focusing on the NESARC. I'm going to show you the marginal effects of the comorbidities. Then I'm going to correct for sample selection bias, and this is the biggie. I'll show you the effect on overall prevalence from sample selection. So here we have psychiatric disorders, substance abuse ones, mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and personality. This is showing you the odds ratios with respect to having a psychiatric disorder. So these results here, actually if it's 1, then the odds are, if you've got it, that you're no more likely to have a psychiatric disorder. So when they're greater than 1, it says if you have the substance abuse, you're far more likely to have a gambling disorder. So the standard literature looking at total effects says it's 5.8, it's 4.77, 6.5, 4.6, big. Way bigger than 1 and statistically significant. If you look at the marginal effects, you can see they're always smaller. Right? They're always smaller. Now let's do one more thing. Let's correct for the sample selection bias. Bam! Look at this. So those were the ones that were the marginal effects I just showed you, right? The 3.22 is that one here. So I'm looking at these guys, but now I'm correcting for the sample selection effect. Zap, it's gone. More importantly, there's a more interesting nuanced story there is all I'm trying to say. But there's more. Let's look at, I apologize for not having a pretty picture here. I hate showing tables, but that's all I have right now. So here I'm predicting the gambling hierarchy. What's the fraction of people who are by the NESARC data and their criteria classified as having no risk, being at risk, a problem gambler, or pathological gambler? And down here, we're seeing that 0.4%. This is the point, remember I showed you that earlier, it was 0.45. We're getting 0.45 here. So this is recovering their result. That's with no sample selection. With sample selection, look at that. It's 6.6 percentage points. Now, is that exactly the right answer? No, there's a lot of assumptions involved in that, but I'm damn sure that's the wrong answer. I'm damn sure that's misleading and biased. Is it precisely that? Forget whether I've got precision here. There are lots of parametric assumptions I'm just telling you about. What I'm trying to say is you've got to worry about the trigger question. What's causing this? You can see up there, we're getting, instead of having 94% of people who have no risk, we only have 61%. That's what's driving it, because those are the people who, remember the 74% who said no to the trigger question? The sample selection correction saying some percentage of those people were misleading you or answered incorrectly. That's what's driving the result. So you see, we have significantly more people at risk, a lot more people who are problem gamblers, and a lot more people who are pathological gamblers. So all I'm saying is you've got to worry about this. It's not just a technical minor matter. Let me conclude on time. Trigger questions, and let me repeat, I've done this for the massive Canadian sample, the CCHS, the mental health. I've got access to the what's called the master file, and we've done it with replicate weights and so forth. I've done it for the British Gambling Prevalence Survey, a very, very good survey. You get essentially the same result. So it's not unique to the American surveys. So the implication is that, well, let me state it rhetorically. I don't want to get too pushy. Have we been significantly underestimating the at-risk fraction to the point where they're no longer asking the questions, right? It's really got serious. We're not even asking anymore. The second point is about comorbidities. And if you look at the conditional comorbidity, it suggests that there's a traumatic overstatement if you only focus on unconditional. And that has important implications for treatment and for therapy, right? So that's the main implication. The two limitations here, I just want to flag again because I want to be honest. Again, you don't get nothing for nothing. One of the problems with sample selection corrections, how do you get data on people you don't sample? If I'm going to build a model of why you decided to participate or not, I know a lot about you if you decided to participate. I know jack about you if you decided not to participate. That's one of the general problems. There are some answers to that. There are ways around that. You have a subsample where you pay them to participate, etc., and you capture their characteristics, so there are ways to do that. Also, if you're super lucky like me and you've got Danish co-authors, you get access to the registry. So I know when you say you're not going to answer my survey, I know 1,000 things about you. It's a beautiful resource for studying that. The second is, and those of you who know this literature will know it, there are statistical parametric assumptions needed to do this correction. I'm not hiding that, and one would want to sort of minimize those, but you've just got to be honest that those are there. So all I'm here to say is beware of any prevalent study that uses a trigger question. And let me leave it there. Any questions? Thank you. Questions? Yeah.
What's the potential for combining survey methodology, like doing, prevalence survey like this and then cluster surveys?
Yeah.
And then, trying to pull those together to find the assumptions?
Absolutely, yeah. This is what the correct solution to this is, other than going to the registry, is you do your large prevalence survey, and these are very costly to field, and you have the trigger question for the general population, but you take a subsample of them, and you simply don't have the trigger question for them. You burn the fact that you're going to take a bit more time with them. So if you're only doing gambling, you would take the whole sample, but you would have a basis then for building the statistical model of what characteristics explain why people participate or not. So you get a complementarity between correcting for sample selection bias, but you're not burdening the whole survey with the cost of doing that.
Wouldn't it be easier then to ask it to do it the other way around, where you have 100% of 95% of the survey has the trigger question, 5%. So those people are then asking a lot more questions because they know people refusal rates go up when the longer things get.
Well, actually, refusal rates are another sample selection bias, which you can capture, but you're along exactly the right ways. Once you start thinking about it and saying, okay, it actually seems to be a bit more important in terms of the bottom line, are there ways to sort of get at it? You've suggested one, I've suggested another, I can think of one or two others as well, but that's the point. You don't have to balloon up the cost of the survey to do this. Yeah, Rachel?
Can you tell us, in the case of the NESARC, since you did not have registry data, how you...
Sure. That's actually where we used information that was asked of, that was specific. There's two ways you can do it. One way is to use the same covariates to explain the probability that someone's got a psychiatric disorder, a pathological gambling disorder, and explain participation. That has the weakness that you rely on the bivariate normal assumption being correct. That's the well-known weakness in the Heckman sample selection question. So what you then try to do is, can I find some identifying covariates that affect the participation but don't affect your answers to the question? In this instance, we had information on the surveyor, we had information on characteristics of the survey. Some were telephone, some were other forms, so we used some of the... No, there were some that were telephone, but they were largely that. So you've got some information on the surveying. I'm completely happy to fess up to the fact that that's a problem with these pre-existing surveys. You don't have as much that identifying information. Usually, we find in the epidemiological studies, if you know, these days people collect information, if it's face-to-face, they collect information on the surveyor, male or female, how pretty. You know, you may not like that, but that has a dramatic effect on responses. So that is one thing that could be used there. Having said that, now that someone is aware of this, one can think of covariates in terms of the survey that you might ask in the common block that can help you identify this. So I agree that it's second best because we often don't have the data we need, but I'm telling you that the magnitude difference is massive. And that's not just the NESARC. This is all of the ones that we've looked at. So I'm perfectly happy to admit that we have to make some parametric assumptions there. But the problem is we've got to deal with it somehow. And I've got to respect the time of the next speaker. Okay, thanks.